All right. The Indian Rebellion in the West, also known as Pontiac's Rebellion, the conspiracy of Pontiac, Pontiac's War. It goes by different names. I'm not sure if Pontiac is the instrumental Native American, as a lot of histories have made him out to be, but certainly he is prominent in his role. Okay, so we're going to talk about, and maybe the theme for today's class is what I saw, doing some reading again and again as a refresher for these classes. What I usually do is just read a couple sources on this story, and it kind of, having taught it every 2 years, it's like, okay, now I remember I'm kind of having to refresh some of these notes. But one line that stuck out that I saw, which might apply to what we're talking about, definitely applies to what we're talking about today, is the French free North America still required attention. So this picks up literally where we left off with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. A French free, meaning France being essentially, except for a little tiny area that they could use to take advantage of fishing off the coast of Canada. But for the most part, the French free North America still required attention. In this case, it required attention from the British. The French were gone, but the British were moving in. Specifically, the American colonists were moving in. You see that happening immediately after 1760. And this is the English unable to control their population. What we don't realize is there are waves of folks moving within the United States, obviously immigration from other parts of the world, forced in the case of slaves, and others who leave parts of Europe or around the world. But within the American colonies, and then later when we were a nation, the United States, the migrations that happen at different points of our history, this is one that's often forgotten from 1760 onwards. The movement of people, I think, is not really understood. You have to consider that how many, 5, 7,000 Acadians are basically vanquished off of Nova Scotia to other parts of the American colonies. Some go to Canada, other part go to the United States. The Floridas clear out because Florida is now 2 new colonies for the British, not the Spanish. The Spanish give the English Florida to get Cuba back, which you can understand why the treaty wasn't super popular in England. The English people are realizing we had won this great victory. Why are we giving things back? And you have to look in the general scheme of things, the overall picture. Maybe England's empire, sprawling empire in 1763, was a lot to handle. You see that they gave back the Philippines. We talked about that. They had control of Manila, but they had an insurrection on their hands. They did hold the line in India. They captured several French colonial areas of India and made England the dominant power in India when the war ended and the treaty happened. We know that, of course, the Spanish joined their ally, the French, because there were a lot of people in Europe who thought England was an unstoppable force. and maybe that was going to be dangerous for the balance of power, not only in the overseas holdings and colonies, but in Europe itself. So poor Spain enters, again, with a secret treaty with their traditional ally, the French, and all the English do is just turn their mighty, geared up army and navy against the Spanish, and it doesn't go well for them. And the other point I want to make in kind of the introduction to this discussion is the idea that we typically understand that there are 2 factors which can potentially incite the American colonists in the 1760s that we think of in this story. And from the very beginning, I wanted to stress to all of you that this is not the French and Indian War, a simple prelude to the American Revolution. This is an important event in the people who we consider to be the revolutionary generation, yes. But the idea that the English had won this great victory, and then it is almost a foregone conclusion. It is almost inevitable that they're going to enact these programs that annoy and cause tension between their colonies. That's not the case at all. We're going to see that more and more starting on Thursday, when in their time of victory, they're going to, after some hard lessons learned here at Pontiac's Rebellion, they're going to put in some reforms that on the face of it, the English think make perfect sense. New colonies. You think about it, at least 4 in North America. Canada, the Indian Reserve, the 2 Floridas. A rapidly moving population. The population shifts after 1760 are dramatic. We don't understand it and appreciate it to this day, but the English and the Indians are going to have to react to that. Okay, so the second part of this idea, first idea, the French free, gone from North America, requires attention. Taxes and reform are critical in this story, absolutely. As is religion, we might say. There are always rumors that the English, especially in areas that are very protective of their faith, the Congregationalists in New England, there's always rumors that the English are going to try to install a bishop or archbishop in North America, in of all places, Massachusetts, where those Congregationalists or Puritans are very protective of their faith. Taxes as well. Something called the Parsons Cause in Virginia in 1763 that puts Patrick Henry on the map as someone who protects the interests of the planters who don't want to pay more taxes to go to the clergy in Virginia, where there is a tax-supported church. So these issues are happening at the very end of the French and Indian War. But what I want to emphasize is that the acquisition of land might be the most important. Because as far as the American colonists are concerned, they won. The Indians lost. And so that gives them the right to continue to move into lands that they want to acquire, irregardless of any of the treaties that were signed by the Indians and all the work that was done by the British to try to either keep the Indians out of the conflict or side with the English. The Iroquois Confederacy, when it joins England in 1758 and 9, is a game changer for the progress of the war. It really, really hurts the French efforts. So the collapse of New France is dreadful news for the Indians in North America. They were able to play off one European power against another. Again, and that's why the Iroquois remained neutral going on 50 years. They could kind of act as an intermediary. They can control the passageways to the interior. The Iroquois thought that they had the ability to drive negotiations in areas all along the Great Lakes. They weren't correct about that. Nevertheless, it's important to understand that with France gone, the balance is off. And the English realize that. And the mistakes that they make from 1760 onwards reflect the idea that the Indians can deal with us or no one, because the French are gone. The French settlers in the Great Lakes and Canada aren't gone. I mean, the French army, and this is technically not French territory anymore, but the French are still there. To the English, this had been a great victory against an enemy who had confined them to the east. As far as the colonists were concerned, one of the fruits of victory in 1760, which is where most of the conflict ends. Remember, Quebec falls 1759, Montreal 1760. So for the most part, the colonists think, well, the fighting's done, it's over. But it's not. It's not at all. We have to look deeper into that and understand that there's an outbreak of violence in areas of the American South. We saw that with the Cherokee War. And also, there's sporadic fighting as these colonists who think, okay, the French are gone. The French and French allied Indians had contained us east of the mountains, east of the Allegheny, if you're talking about Pennsylvania and Virginia and Maryland, and now we're going to move out into the west. And this caused a great deal of apprehension among Native Americans in North America. What's overlooked in this story is the Indians never thought that they lost, and as far as they were concerned, this is their land. This is their land. And now it's all handed over to the British. So it's going to, again, there'll be deep consequences for the English success. The British troops, starting after 1760, begin to occupy the old French forts in the west, especially south of the Great Lakes. There are upwards of 11 of them, thinking of the old French forts. And when they occupied this area, the traders and the trappers were not far behind. I mean, Fort Pitt was rebuilt on the burned out ashes of Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio. The British built a more massive fort, and they were going to occupy it with several hundred soldiers. The other forts, you may be surprised to find, are occupied by 20, 15, 50 soldiers. Not many at all. Because as far as the English are concerned, the war in North America is over. The fighting is shifting to other parts, like all the soldiers that were needed against the siege in Havana. The English were also demobilizing their army in North America. So they were going to have a skeleton force left in the American colonies. That's expected. The French are gone. The Indians have to deal with us now. The colonists, well, I think they really underestimated the desire of the colonists to move into that area. When Fort Pitt, again, is occupied by British soldiers, they allow, do the British, settlements around Fort Pitt. This will be later, of course, Greater Pittsburgh. And the Indian view of this is, why are all these folks here? I mean, occupying our land. I mean, it's one thing to have the soldiers right there within the fort. It's something entirely different to see these what look like permanent settlements. You know, the traders and trappers are there. Okay, they're kind of transient, and the seasons dictate, you know, how these people come and go, but not the cabins that we're seeing and the dwellings that are popping up in places like the Wyoming Valley, which is north of Philadelphia and eastern Pennsylvania. In eastern Delaware, I thought, well, we signed a treaty and we thought that's going to keep all the settlers off this area, and it's clearly not. So deep-seated resentments are beginning. They're beginning in 1760 and 1761. In other areas, colonists begin to flood the Ohio country and the Great Lakes region looking for a quick profit. The Ohio country is where the war started. And now with the French gone, it's time for the American colonists to seize the initiative. These settlers have no interest in cultivating any kind of relationship with the natives in the areas as the French had done. The French put in the work and know that they have to make and require, not just need, but they have to have Indian allies to try to balance the overwhelming British supply line and the number of soldiers there, and of course the population of the American colonists. 1750, it's 1.5 million, as opposed to about 70,000 French. So that you need the Indian allies if you're the French, and now the French are gone. The colonial governors, meanwhile, have little interest. This is for the most part appointed by the king, their royal colonies. In the case of Pennsylvania, the Penn family is still running that colony. But the royal governors, the king's appointee, the king's man in each colony, seem to have little interest in actually holding back this movement of people into the Indian lands, whether it be in New York, Western Massachusetts, the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, the Ohio country, towards the Cherokee lands. That's what caused one of the causes of the Cherokee conflict. The Cherokee go help the English against the siege of Fort Duquesne, which is successful. And then when they return, they see cabins and they see settlers from the Carolinas move into their lands along the spine of the mountains there, the Appalachians, as they move south across the Carolinas. So the governors do little to hold back these settlers in their respective regions. From 1760 onward, the perception is over. It had been a success for the English. And as far as the colonists are concerned, that's what it had been all about. The French and Indians held them back. Now the victorious, they get to move. It's time to finally cash in on the speculative land, to either purchase it. A lot of the colonial governors, they're not going to hold back their colonists in their respective colony or area, but they also want to participate. You know, remember, the Ohio Company was started by, among other people, the leadership in Virginia, the Virginia royal governor, and the Washington family and other folks. So tensions among the Native Americans begin, and there's a lot of still debate over to what degree. Obviously, the settlement into new areas was part of it, but with the English wanting to engage in cost-saving measures, this seemed to be a real trigger as far as the Indians were concerned. The British commander-in-chief is Geoffrey Amherst at the time, and Amherst is told by his bosses in London, the fighting in North America is winding down. Soldiers will be removed not shifted as much. They're going to occupy, they're going to keep soldiers in North America, much to the disappointment of the American colonists. But at the same time, you have to tighten belt, cut costs. There's a realization in 1761 and 2, as happy as the English are that they had military success, they had basically had naval superiority outside of Canada that allows Montreal and Quebec to fall. They had been able to turn their war machine against the Spanish, but also in England, the war debt is astronomically high. And as many people want to keep fighting after 1762, the English and French and Spanish engage in the negotiations that eventually lead to the Treaty of Paris. So there's an overwhelming sense that the war had cost a lot. Pitt's policies of pouring money, like giving blank checks to the colonial governors, was going to have to be paid for at some point. So with the new empire, with the new colonies, you're going to have to spend money there, save money, and maybe even raise revenue in the colonies themselves. So the first thing they do is to end the traditional practice, and this is Amherst's call, General Amherst's call in 1762 and 3, to cut off the generous delivery of presents and trade goods brought from Europe to Native Americans. It is Amherst's conclusion that this was very wasteful. Why don't we need to do this? The French are gone, they deal with us, and they don't deal with anybody. It's really bad English policy. Why bother to do this when the French competition is gone? Amherst suffers from a delusion that his troops scattered on the frontier can control the area. That control the French knew was on that time-honored tradition. The French were willing, through the history of Canada, to lose money. It cost them more to run Canada and North America than what they got out of it in exports. But if they didn't lose that money and continue to spend it, it would be conceding everything to England, which they had to militarily. But it's Amherst who makes that decision, and there will be, again, fateful results because of this. The English don't fully understand the complicated relationships that you have to have in the West. So the feeling among Native Americans early on is that the English don't respect the fact that this is their land, ancestral, and they are not controlling their colonial population. And at the same time, adding insult to injury, they don't want to continue the time-honored practice of gift-giving, wagon loads of goods. Sir William Johnson, who's been mentioned in other discussions and in the podcast, is one of those British leaders, the Indian superintendent, who says, "Are you kidding me? Are you're really gonna?" He just completely disagrees with Amherst's policy and knows it's going to have fateful results. Tribes that had been rivals, bands of Indians, didn't have a lot in common, and few contact amongst each other, begin to ally themselves against one enemy. Not a good thing for the English. This is the first signs of trouble in the British West. The lesson here that the French knew, but the English were going to learn the hard way, is that you don't mistreat the Indians, which they're beginning to do very quickly. South Carolina first erupted in war in 1759 between Cherokee and the settlers. Again, you learned about the background of the Cherokee War, a war within a war that a lot of people don't recognize. The British had to send several expeditions into the Cherokee towns to burn and pillage villages. It's a surprise conflict where few people expected there to be any trouble in that area, let alone the British commanders who had to shift resources and soldiers, several expedition, and this instigates reforms by the British Indian superintendent. One of them is the governors weren't going to be able to just blanketly allow grants of land to colonists. That was going to prevent, hopefully, another flare-up like the Cherokee uprising. And it keeps the peace. But if you know anything about the conclusion of the Cherokee conflict, the mindset of the Cherokee Indians is that, well, yeah, you may have destroyed, you may have basically taken out our ability to fight, but we don't feel overwhelmingly defeated here. And so they had, and remember, in this conflict, captured a British fort, in the area of the West, in western South Carolina. Lesson learned here. Lesson learned by the Indians in the Great Lakes who are very familiar with the English policies in the Cherokee War and the success, not the ultimate failure, but the success that the Cherokee had. They pick up on this and they understand and appreciate it. So the governors are unable to stop the traders and small groups from swindling land for English trade goods dealing with individual Indians. And this reaction influences the behavior of northern tribes after 1760. In the spring of 1763, Indians of the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes covertly begin to prepare for war. They pass along communications, pass along wampum belts, a history of the different Indian nations, one side for peace, one side for war, very often is the case. Now, I list there on the notes the different Indian nations of the Great Lakes who are beginning to combine, don't often have a lot in common, but have a unified enemy, the British and the British colonists. They are the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, the Huron, the Miami, the Kickapoo, and the Seneca, which are the western group of the Iroquois Confederacy. They find a new common ground in these shared grievances with the British policies. Soldiers are the enemy, settlers are the enemy, and traders. The first rebellion in the American colonies in 1763 is an Indian country. We might. I don't. No, I'm not. I'm not sure. You know, it could. Many of these names are anglicized names of what they heard the Indians refer to themselves as. And that's the best definition I can give you of that. Yeah. The other part of this, which is not appreciated, I don't think, but has to be understood, is a religious revival element. I mean, this is a pan-Indian confederacy. It doesn't happen a lot. You're probably familiar with another one that happens in really kind of the same area before the War of 1812, as of course Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet. Well, that's 1810, 1812 in the American West. The spiritual leader of the Pontiac's rebellion is the Lenni Lenape, which again is Eastern Delaware, essentially, Eastern Delaware Indian. Lenni Lenape, again, growing up in that area, we always knew the Indians of New Jersey were called the Lenni Lenape. They were a branch of the Eastern Delaware Indians. His name is Neolin, or Nowlin it's actually pronounced. And he reinforced the new identity for the Indians. There's a religious part of all of this. It combined Christianity with some native traditions, a hybrid kind of religion that many Indian nations and groups had adopted. Overall, Nowlin preaches a stoppage to the cession of land, stopping using alcohol, which is where negotiations take place because a lot of Indians get hooked on it. And genetically, Indians, we now know this, need apparently little alcohol to get really drunk. And so their resistance or word I'm looking tolerance, thank you. Their tolerance for alcohol, not very high. What makes this rebellion different is the wide-ranging appeal of Nowlin's message. He begins to talk about communications he had with the Indian creator, known simply as the Master of Life. Master of Life, Nowlin insisted, was punishing the Indians for their behavior recently, for essentially adopting European ways. That's what made them weak and susceptible to have their lands taken. That behavior included dependence on alcohol, dependence on European trade goods, selling out lands to white settlers and traders. And the punishment for this, the punishment for the sins, according to Nowlin, from the Master of Life and Creator of all things, was illness, hard winters, no game. Pontiac becomes kind of the recognized leader of the rebellion, although that is not completely accurate as far as the English were concerned. He is, but the more we kind of step away from this, he's one of the leaders. He has a prominent role, as we're going to find out. Pontiac becomes the war chief. He's Ottawa. He's an Ottawa Indian associated with this uprising, and repeats Nowlan's message. This is from the spring. This is May of 1763. This is Chief Pontiac. It is important for us, my brothers, that we exterminate from our lands this nation which seeks only to destroy us. You see as well as I do that we can no longer supply our needs as we have done from our brothers the French. The English sell us goods twice as dear as the French do, and their goods do not last. Scarcely have we bought a blanket or something else to cover ourselves with before we must think of getting another. And when we wish to set out for our winter camp, they do not want to give us any credit as our brothers the French do. When I go see the English commander and say to him that some of our comrades are dead, instead of bewailing their death as our French brothers do, he laughs at me and at you. If I ask for anything for our sick, he refuses with the reply that he has no use for us. From all this, you can well see that they are seeking our ruin. Therefore, my brothers, we must all swear their destruction and wait no longer. Nothing prevents us. They are few in numbers, and we can accomplish it. It's Pontiac. So there is, again, genuine grievances among the Indian nations, but Nowlan combines this kind of revivalist idea. The message carries pan-Indian themes, and different Indians groups can find agreement among themselves. Not good for the English as far as they are concerned. Swearing off alcohol, European guns, get back to the old ways of traditional living. The message spreads from New York to Minnesota. You can see how Pontiac adopts it by the spring of 1763. Also, what's happening in Native American groups is new militant chiefs are leading the way. There is a split in Indian communities. We saw this with the Cherokee conflict. Accommodationist leaders, sometimes older, who say, look, give up land to allow our survival to continue. Younger chiefs who say, absolutely not. Draw a line in the sand. They can't cross it. If they do, we attack. So this is a divide within different Indian groups in the spring of 1763. But I think the more militant groups are definitely following Nowlan and Pontiac's message. The British, of course, played right into Indian hands. There is no gifts to alleviate the suffering that Pontiac was talking about. And yes, there is widespread disease, shortage of food. The French address that. The English don't. British commanders in forts and traders watched developments of Nowlan's message and Pontiac traveling through areas south of the Great Lakes with growing apprehension. William Johnson is one of them, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs. He's based in New York. He'd been living in the American colonies for quite a long time. But as far as it trickling down to the rank and file folks, maybe even those who are the civilian leadership of the colonies, there's only a few groups. The highest echelon officers in New York, Philadelphia, show anything remotely resembling any kind of concern over what's happening. They should have, but they're not. During the spring of 1763, far-flung native people surprised British forts around the Great Lakes. Let's take a look at a map here. And I'll show you the extent of Pontiac's success in the American West. And get this thing to go up eventually. Okay. Let's try this again. Oops, sorry. Okay. It's kind of like last time. The share tray doesn't want to share all the time. Let's see if we can get it to work here. Okay. Let's go back to the notes. Okay, that's working. Let's switch it to this. Well, sorry, everybody. We'll get it to work, I think. May is where the attacks start to happen. And it looks really coordinated. And that's what throws the English off and really just absolutely surprises them and causes, even when the attacks start, this kind of misunderstanding about why it's taking place, what the goals of the Indians are, and for the English, that they had any role in it. I mean, it's not our fault. What are we doing? It doesn't make any. Okay, that looks like it can be seen, hopefully. All right, here we go. Got a couple of maps that deal with the extent of Pontiac's rebellion. So you can see the attacks begin in May of 1763. I think this map is good too. Yeah. This is even a broader extent of the entire part of Pontiac's war, Pontiac's rebellion. The conspiracy of Pontiac. That was Francis Parkman. This is 100+ years ago. Wrote this epic multi-volume history of the French and Indian War, and the last volume was literally Pontiac's conspiracy, which puts him front and center, which is not exactly accurate. Okay, so settlements began to be raided in areas of western Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. Yes, this is an attack on the different English forts of the southern Great Lakes, but the other thing to consider is that civilians are attacked as well. I mean, as Indians have been attacked and non-combatants have been involved in the deaths during the entire French and Indian War. The English mindset in 1763, especially amongst the colonists, is that it was the French and Indian War, not the French and Spanish War. So all the Indians, and it's an unfortunate modern term that's been applied, modern as far as the 19th century, among some that say, look, the Indians are in the way, we have to move them, they lost, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, and that's what we need to keep that policy. We're going to see that really play out with the Paxton Boys massacre that happens in 1763. Okay, so here are the attacks which begin, and they seem coordinated. They are. They're spontaneous, and Pontiac doesn't actually order all of them, but they certainly take place. He's prominent in the attack on areas in the West. In the grand scheme of things, there's an expectation among the British and I think some Indians that any military success they have will bring the French back into North America. So we hit the English, capture the forts. In some cases, these forts were captured. They had, again, I mentioned anywhere from 12 to 50 soldiers inside the fort. Some of them were allowed to be paroled and they'd evacuate the fort. Others were promised that they would be able to go back to another fort that the Indians hadn't captured. In some cases, they're killed and massacred. In some cases, British commanders are actually killed in front of their own soldiers. So again, this is incredibly violent. The attacks against the civilians by the Indians are upwards of about 2,000 in western Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. So the way the English leaders see it is that it is a conspiracy of French allies, and of course it is led by the French. The French are pulling the strings as far as the beginning of Pontiac's rebellion. The French instigate this, and of course, their Indians carry out their plans. Why? So that maybe the English will see the West as untenable and turn it back over to the French, which isn't going to happen. The French don't have any interest in it. But doesn't it show us something about how the English reaction plays out? Oh, this must be a grand plan by the French, directed by the French, for the benefit of the French. It shows you that they continue to be kind of clueless about what their policies had really done to Native Americans in the West. It also, of course, clears them of any responsibility that we have done this, this was our fault, our policies were awful, and now we're paying a price. Again, the military effort around the world for the English is starting to wind down. What the hell is going on in the West? They've got to shift soldiers, resources. This is going to last for over a year. This isn't a flare-up that just lasts for a couple of months and everything's over. They have to fight for a period of something like 14 or 15 months to retake these forts through military excursions and very careful negotiations amongst the Indians that they felt, the Indians who felt that they were wronged. The strategy hits a roadblock, however, because you can see that the forts fall. Fort St. Joseph, Fort Miami, but several of them, three of them don't. Three of the most important forts don't fall to the Indian allies of Pontiac. And from west to east there, Fort Detroit. Now that's under attack, under siege. Fort Pitt, right there in western Pennsylvania. And Fort Niagara. See battle sites around three of them, where in those three cases, Bloody Run and Bushy Run and Devil's Hole, this was an effort of the English to send reinforcements to these forts. So the Indians had put these forts under siege. This is not typical Indian wartime policy to direct a siege, but Pontiac, what's interesting about him, and we know something about his background, we know he was probably at Braddock's defeat on the Monongahela, so we could see how surprise is critical. We know he was actually at one of the sieges during the actual French and Indian War. We believe it was the siege and eventual surrender of Fort William Henry in upstate New York. And we also think he was a part of, again, we think, but there's pretty good evidence of this, that he was associated with the British attack on Quebec. So the French came out of the fort, right, and the English devastated them in 15 minutes, and the Battle of Quebec was over. So we learned from all of this: surprise, battlefield tactics, and how to lead a siege. But a siege takes time. And though a lot of these different forts were captured, some of them weren't. The three key ones that I mentioned: Niagara, Fort Pitt, and Fort Detroit, which was just a trading post until the English really built it up into something more substantial. They were resupplied, these forts, and relief forces were sent with troops to some degree of success. This is not very easy for Amherst to try to back up and send soldiers. Most of them are in other places like Cuba, and that's where the English efforts are in 1763 until they have to give that back. He does Amherst request, here's Amherst, I got a slide of him somewhere. There's Nowlin, there's Pontiac. Again, conjecture of how these folks looked, we're not exactly sure. Jeffrey Amherst, yeah, full in his uniform there. Looks like a medieval knight, but that's how they often pose for their paintings. So Amherst requested troops from New England, and the New England governments politely declined, again, reinforcing the idea that the colonists don't really have a common cause, because as far as the New Englanders are concerned, they're looking at the map thinking, and this affects us how? And we should do what? And it's going to cost us how much? It's a shame, because the New England's militia had more experience fighting during the French and Indian War. A lot of them were veterans of the conflict, and they may have been able to help. So to supplement Amherst, his small forces, his paltry number of soldiers with colonial militia wasn't really at all a success. Much like the British had done in the past when fighting the natives, they find one scapegoat. The British think and call it quickly, they adopt the name Pontiac's War or Pontiac's Rebellion. There's Pontiac. He's in Ottawa. He's not the mastermind of this, but it is Pontiac who is leading the siege of the unsuccessful siege of Fort Detroit. So is he coordinating all this? Well, he certainly seems to be a person instrumental in what happens in the spring of 1763, but he isn't the only one. For some reason, the English decide to designate him as kind of the person who put all of this together. At one point, Amherst puts £100 sterling reward for the death of Pontiac, a price on the guy's head, essentially. And so that tells you that the English think if he's out of the picture, the whole Indian conspiracy is going to collapse. The campaign is brilliant, and to the English, it looks coordinated. We can see that it completely catches the Indian forts off guard starting in May and June of 1763. All territory from the Appalachian Mountains to the Great Lakes is effective, and that's what makes it look like it is coordinated. It is swift, it is surprising, and Indians leading sieges. I mean, a siege is where you basically surround this British trading post or fort, cut off all connection to the outside world, which would include food and more ammunition and more soldiers and supplies throughout weeks and then months, possibly. This is what should impress us of Pontiac's efforts. In one case, this is maybe you're familiar with the story, I've heard it before, up in the future Michigan territory. This is called Fort, buddy? Michilimackinac or something like that. Yeah, I think that's how it's pronounced. Fort at the top of the map, Michilimackinac. That's close. Yeah, I know. That's how I've heard it pronounced before. So we're going to go with that. This worked in other surprise attacks on the English forts in the Great Lakes, but this one stands out. The Indians in the area were actually playing a form of what we now would recognize as lacrosse outside the fort, which was not unusual. There were French traders there because this used to be French territory, and they would be familiar with the Indians of the area. They were there watching. The Indians specifically were told not to attack any of the French near the fort. But as they played this game, the guard of the English was kind of down, and they took the lacrosse ball, and someone on a prearranged set of movements and agreements threw the ball into the fort, and several of the Indians went inside to go fetch it, and that's where there are other non-combatant Indians and women were giving out weapons as the Indians ran inside the fort, and that's when the capture of it took place. Killed the guards and captured the rest of the contingent there in that particular fort. They massacred a lot of the non-British combatants, traders and trappers who were there. Women had hid guns and blankets out of sight of the soldiers in the fort. The grand prize, however, unable to capture Fort Detroit, was Fort Pitt. This is the one that was symbolic in a number of ways. You have the outlying area where settlers began to move after 1761 and 1762. It was an area of resentment for the Indians because they thought the fort would be there, that's fine, but the settlements that were growing around it, they just didn't understand that this is for the American colonists. This was part of what they should get for being successful in the conflict. Built on the confluence of 3 rivers in western Pennsylvania, it is acknowledged to be the strongest fort in North America. The Indians had surrounded it, but were unable to reduce it or make it surrender. The British sent a relief force that got beat up very badly, but nevertheless made it to the fort. When the Indians demand terms from the British commander, he respectfully declines. And then, apparently this is upon orders of General Amherst, commander-in-chief of the British forces there. He disperses gifts to the Indians that he had met with in a parley. It's basically a meeting to discuss the possibility of there being some kind of surrender terms. And with that, the British commander inside Fort Pitt had gone to the hospital inside the fort. Now, these soldiers were suffering, those in Fort Detroit, those in Fort Niagara. They were all needing more supplies and everything else. But the question began more and more as 1763 went on into the summer and fall. Would the Indians be able to continue this siege? Would they be able to surround it, stay there, and their lives are put on hold, obviously. This is what kind of, in many ways, undoes Pontiac's rebellion. Will you be able to keep the Indians there long enough so that the siege is successful? And then when those 3 forts don't fall, the English begin to push back. So going back to Fort Pitt, the parley happens, and the English commander visits the hospital inside Fort Pitt. Several of the people there who had taken refuge inside the fort, civilians and some of the soldiers, were stricken with smallpox. And smallpox is highly contagious. That's why you isolate the people who have it. So what he did is went to the hospital ward, and the blankets that were being used by the smallpox patients were then presented to the Indians as gifts. Those who were waiting outside the fort to talk about the possibility of resupply, or in case of the Indians, hoping for an actual surrender. So blankets and handkerchiefs from the smallpox ward of the hospital were passed on. If this was germ warfare, as we would call it today, and a violation of all these kind of treaties we've had for probably at least 100 years, it is Amherst who later said it had, and he said, the desired effect, which means it would pass the smallpox along to those who were besieging Fort Pitt. Whether or not it was, again, a preordained idea is still up for debate. Amherst's hands are tied, so he seemed to rely on really desperate measures. There's a lack of soldiers, British soldiers. There's a lack of colonial support. And the relief efforts were, again, in some cases successful, in some cases not. As far as the English were concerned, and this is where William Johnson, who was hearing the grumblings of dissatisfaction on the frontier, he began to undermine Amherst's efforts. Again, Amherst was responsible for these policies. The English reaction in London to all of this is, what the hell, I thought the war was over. The fighting stopped in 1760. What is going on? And now, all the English want to blame Pontiac for the conspiracy and the war. Now everyone in London blames Amherst for what had taken place, even though he's kind of carrying on the orders of the English, which is tighten the belts, spend less money in the American colonies. He's told you can't expect any more troops. And you really can't expect to get any more from any other place where the British soldiers are actually stationed around the world. Rather than concede, Amherst, that his pre-rebellion policies had caused any problems, he tried to fight the Indians with his limited resources, which is what he began to do, push back at the end of 1763 and beginning of 1764. In Detroit, the attack on Detroit, which is, this is a dramatization of, well, this doesn't look like any of the forts, but it's one of the ones that really was the last to hold out. This is impressive when we think about it. There were, in the area of Detroit, 900 Indians besieging the area from 6 different Indian nations. How long they were going to stay there is a whole other matter. And this led to stagnation in Pontiac's rebellion. Also, you get to a couple of factors that are involved. The Indians they're reliant upon, no matter what Nowlan said, they need ammunition, they need lead, shot for their muskets, they're relying on modern British guns. You need gunpowder, you need flints, all of that to make the muskets work. And what the English did, and typically had done in previous conflicts with Indians, is that they very much shut down trade, any kind of trade, with the different Indian groups, so that they have no more ammunition. And they also have to make a choice. When the Indians get into the late summer and fall, their warriors have to return to feed their families, to hunt for the wintertime, so they will not starve. Stay at Fort Detroit, the other forts that are being besieged, the 3 of them, Fort Niagara, or go back home. This is the big question as we go into 1764. The Indians also don't have, short of supplies and short of manpower, to add to the siege of these forts. So the rebellion begins to lose steam. The ammunition that you have, you need to hunt. The guns, I mean, when the flint breaks, the flint that causes the spark that allows the musket to work, you need another flint. If you can't get one, the gun is ineffective and becomes basically a club or a walking stick. I mean, you just can't use it. The irony, of course, in all this story is that as the rebellion started, the ministry had already thought about measures to keep this from happening. Policy changes already kind of countermanding what they had been telling Amherst tighten the belt. You're not going to have as many soldiers. You're not going to have as many resources. So though there is no central command to this rebellion, it might have been one of the other factors why the English were in the end successful in turning the tide militarily. Again, it is Pontiac who was there. They're trying to negotiate with them at the besieging Fort Detroit. Scattered tribes had different reasons to go to war. And those that were suffering maybe the most were those civilians, and certainly the Indians were living on the sidelines. There was an ugly element to this conflict, an ugly racial war. That, of course, is something we have to talk about. The settlers had treated all Indians, regardless of their allegiance, as far as they were concerned, as allied to the French. The French had lost the war. This led to an incident in Pennsylvania, which was known as the Paxton Boys Massacre. See if I can get these notes a little bit larger for us to see. Okay. In this case, a group that was not at all involved in Pontiac's rebellion. The friendly Conestoga Indians were the victims. Groups of peaceful Conestoga Indians fell victim to colonists in Pennsylvania who were killing and burning their cabins. The violence continued as the Paxton Boys marched to a county jail. What happened among those colonists who were not part of the Paxton Boys? This is a vigilante justice, is what it was. Again, frustrated by the fact that the frontier was being attacked by different Indian groups, not the Conestoga Indians, but others, the Western Delaware, Shawnee. So the frontier was, again, 2,000 casualties. This is not soldiers, this is not combatants during Pontiac's rebellion. So the mindset of people who followed and joined the Paxton Boys was, look, the Indians are all allied against us. Conestoga Indians were actually Christianized Indians in Pennsylvania. So as there were attacks against them, those whites who sympathized with the Conestoga Indians said, we should take others who had not been killed already and slaughtered and put them in a safety in a county jail in Pennsylvania for their own safety, so that they will be protected from the marauding Paxton Boys. Well, they decided they were going to open the jail, which they did, and begin to slaughter the Conestoga Indians. The violence continues as they march to this jail and, again, probably killed several dozen Indians, and then determined from there, the Paxton Boys, to march further east towards Philadelphia. They were stopped, however, by British troops, thankfully, before the slaughter continued. Their goal, the Paxton Boys, had been to kill 140 different Indians who had been gathered for their protection in Philadelphia. But the mob there stopped them before they could actually carry that out. And the Paxton Boys kind of melted back into the Pennsylvania countryside. They were never, ever prosecuted for any of that. So during the summer of 1764, again, this continues. I said 14 or 15 months. The beginning battles started May, June 1763. During the summer of 1764, Pontiac's rebels begin to run low on gunpowder and shot. There's no supply, or there's no more French or English traders. English are very carefully and effective of clamping down even people who just like, look, we'll trade to anybody, even the Indians. They clamp down on an ability to resupply Pontiac's rebels. The Crown wants to end the fighting as badly as Indians, and so they begin to start talking and trading European goods, what they had cut off the year before, to bring about individual Indian groups for signing treaties and promising and pledging to go back to their homes and end the besieging of the three English forts. Amherst takes most of the blame, and should. He returns to England, recalled by London. His policies had basically been responsible, so London at least perceives, to start Pontiac's rebellion. And the new commander that they put in place is a veteran of the French and Indian War, going back to, he had been there with Braddock and Washington, Thomas Gage. New overall, a name we will be more and more familiar with. Thomas Gage is the new commander of the British forces in North America. It is Gage who, at at some point even kind of helped undercut his superior, Amherst, and listens to the advice of the British Indian superintendents. Give presents, treat them with respect, and oh yeah, here's a simple equation, everybody. Giving presents, continuing the practice that the French have been a part of, is cheaper than going to war, which is what they quickly found out. For 2 years after Pontiac's rebellion, the siege of the different forts are lifted, well into 1765 and 1766, the British have to mend fences with Indians, rebuild alliances that had been absolutely scorched by what took place during Pontiac's rebellion. Pontiac, again, much like the Cherokee, who thought, look, we had been beaten up, our towns, our scattered towns had been burned, our ability to make war and to feed ourselves had been definitely compromised, but they didn't felt like they lost at the end of this. The Cherokee came out strong as they had in 1761. Pontiac has that same attitude, as evidenced by this quote that I have here. We tell you now that the French never conquered us, neither did they purchase a foot of our country, nor have they a right to give it to you. We gave them liberty to settle, for which they always rewarded us and treated us with great civility. If you expect to keep these posts, we will expect to have proper returns from you. You have it laid out there. This is exactly what the British officials begin to do. Gift giving, again, cheaper than war on the frontier. And to help make sure that Indians and colonists do not have contact, which usually leads to hard feelings, resentments, and then conflict and war, what's going to happen is the English have already decided, again, before this Pontiac's rebellion is over, there's going to be a new set of reforms. One of them is a new boundary line to keep settlers from initiating another conflict. People often get the cause and effect confused of Pontiac's rebellion. They say, oh, Pontiac's rebellion happened, and then the English decided that they're effectively going to close the frontier. Let me show you on a map what we're talking about. If I can get this to work again. With the dam. Boundary between, nope, I don't think that worked. English colonists and their Indian allies. Let's see. We're talking about the infancy of what will later be known as Proclamation Line. There it is right here. The Royal Proclamation of 1763. Now, this map I like for a couple of reasons, chief of which is that it shows you, again, that the French presence in North America is gone, that the British colonies extend to the Mississippi River. This is all Treaty of Paris information, obviously. And the English were going to do this. And then Pontiac's rebellion happened. It wasn't, oh, look, we have another conflict in the West. We should close the frontier. Keep our American colonists from crossing that line, the Appalachians, all the way down to the new colonies of Florida. That's what people confuse about the story. They were going to do this anyway. Pontiac's rebellion reinforced the idea that they had to do this. It was absolutely a necessary reform. So when the war ends with the treaty in 1763, what did we learn from all this? The English had a tenuous grip on the Great Lakes, a tenuous grip. They were occupying the old French forts. They were hoping to occupy them with as few soldiers, which was needed. And the peace conferences, which begin to happen in 1764 and 1765, they recognize that this was going to have to be occupied. There was going to be a lot of work to do with keeping Indians out of the conflict. Was 1763 this grand conspiracy or a Native American war for independence? It's still being debated to this day. The British and Spanish and the French had all fought over this continent, and it was clear to many of the American colonists who the loser in the conflict was. They thought it was the French and the Spanish and the Indians. That's never clear to the Indians. They don't consider themselves to have lost. The French are gone. This is still their land. And English miscalculations and missteps really helped create this situation. If the Indians were disgruntled, again, the first rebellion after the war is an Indian country. Again, if you had taken a class, this class, decades before, it might not have been spoken about that way. You would have thought, oh yeah, of course, maybe someone mentioned Pontiac's rebellion and the need to raise revenue in the colonies, and we know about the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, which we're going to get into a lot of detail over the next couple of discussions. But you might not have had this front and center, Pontiac's rebellion. New colonies, new responsibilities. So we have to consider that the Indians weren't happy in the West. Indians weren't happy at English policies, the fact that they had never, as part of their alliance with the French, surrendered their ability to control their land in the West. That's what this was all about. Further, to add to that, the colonists had reasons of their own to be unhappy. The presence of English soldiers in North America was going to be permanent after 1763. There would be soldiers there. They were going to stay. To what level, they weren't clear just yet. The reason that they didn't like this, well, of course, was there was no threat. Well, if you're living along the East Coast, at least, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, okay, the war's over. We've defeated both the French and the Spanish. Why in the world do we need to keep this presence of soldiers in peacetime? English don't like peacetime armies, either do the colonists. That's why we have that kind of same kind of distrust that goes back to, obviously, this time period. There would also be, and this was cracked down before the war even ended, new efforts to control smuggling. The American colonists during the war traded with the French, the enemy of the English, to which the American colonists would say, why do we have to economically suffer in a time of war? Which the English, the governors, royal governors, and the officers and the foot soldiers and the generals were saying, because it's the French. To which the colonists were saying, well, I know, but we're in New York, and the French are right there in Canada, right? I mean, we saw what happened when the English would capture a French or a Spanish island in the Caribbean. The French or the Spanish colonists there thought, hey, not bad. We now have the ability to take our goods into English markets. So for a while in Cuba, the Spanish were thinking, oh, this is okay. I mean, we're going to be controlling, and in many cases, we know that when the British captured some of those islands in the Caribbean, what was the English response? Was, oh, you can stay, French colonists, practice your faith, and now your goods will be able to move to English markets around the world, and not just French. And the French colonists in Martinique and Guadeloupe were like, yeah, this is great. And the Spanish in Cuba were like, yeah, this is fine. So the American colonists thought, just because there's a war on with our traditional enemy, the French, doesn't mean we can't profit from it. To which the English officers and officials were like, come on, really? I mean, they're our enemy. And the colonists were like, yeah, well, profits are profits and money is money.
It's still like that today.
Hey, the almighty dollar. But the almighty dollar they were very sensitive about, because there were rumors already making their way from England to the colonies, and people that were in the know in the colonies, that there were going to be taxes associated with keeping these soldiers in the colonies. For your own protection, the English would say. Obviously, if we're gone, you're going to move out to the West, the Indians will attack, you'll be like, help! And we'll say that from the English point of view, yeah, well, help costs a lot. So, keeping you on one side of this border and the Indians on the other would probably be a great idea. To which the colonists would say, I don't get it. I mean, we won the war. The fruit of victory includes moving west. And the English would say, did we not just have Pontiac's rebellion? Do you not understand? So there has to be a cost involved in keeping the soldiers in North America. So the resentments are, we've heard with the Indians, but with the colonists, they are, wow, we have to keep a British force, sustained force here. And if you're not familiar with this story, you have to know that the British hadn't, with only few exceptions, kept soldiers in North America. permanently. The defensive force of the colonies are the militia. And only in time of real crises had the English sent soldiers, and when they do, they go back. Now they're going to keep them there after 1763. The other part of this story is that it seemed, as far as the perception, and often in history, perception is the reality. The perception for the colonists is these decisions are being made without our consent. They're being made for us. The British will say on behalf of us, but we don't seem to have a say. So that's the end of the story of Pontiac's rebellion. The next part of it picks up, obviously, with the British plan for reforms. It is not a premeditated dark conspiracy of, oh, we won in Pontiac's rebellion. We finally beat back the Indian military success. And now we're going to, again, isolate and really annoy the colonists in just, 10 short years. That's not the case at all. That's the imperial perspective, the schools of thought we were going through with different interpretations of the American Revolution, that this is what the English sought out to do. But we're going to look at it from a different perspective. These reforms were necessary, they made sense, they were logical, and they were put together by some pretty smart people in England. They just didn't understand the colonist point of view. The story the English were getting in London were smuggling continued, the Americans were living real well. Land is cheap, their lifestyle is good, if not better than in England, and they weren't paying their fair share. So that influences English policies after 1763. And that's where the story will pick up next time.